Cultural appropriation is fundamentally a good thing. In fact, there is no way whatsoever to ever argue that cultural appropriation is bad whilst still maintaining a straight face and at least a veneer of mental sanity. Let's explore. Oh, hi there, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. A few months ago, there was an event in this city organized by an immigrant coming from the former Western Bloc. The details about the event are unimportant. What is important is that a few days prior to this event, the immigrant organizer asked around if it is okay to use a woman wearing a bindi, which is that dot that is traditional on the foreheads of Indian women. Most people that the organizer did ask reacted with amazement, but not at the proposal itself, but at the fact that the question on whether it is okay or not even exists. Because, you see, in this city, you would have to try really hard to find someone that knows why in the world would it not be okay to have a woman with a bindi at an event. The immigrant organizer explained that since 100% of the women available for this event are, well, white, and the bindi is an Indian symbol, that is cultural appropriation, and in this person's home country, that's considered something bad, or at the very least, problematic. Now, most people who witnessed this moment or heard about it in the city simply laughed out loud and shrugged it off as yet another incredibly bizarre and downright messed up ideas that immigrants from the former Western Bloc tend to have. You see, whilst we generally get along with immigrants from the former Western Bloc, we think of their oversensitivity on petty nonsense as a sign of complete and utter disconnect from real life. In my country, we only tolerate this in children younger than 5. Okay, maybe 6. But not older than that, because school commences soon, and you have to toughen up and face the real world, kid. This incident made me realize that the so-called controversy over cultural appropriation is not limited to Dumbler and Dumbler degenerates and messed up academics with way too much time on their hands, but it's rather an idea that has already spilled over the rest of the society to such an extent that I can even encounter it here in Transylvania, although still limited to only amongst a certain kind of immigrants. The ever-reliable Wikipedia defines cultural appropriation as a sociological concept which views the adoption or use of elements of one culture by members of a different culture as a largely negative phenomenon. Generally, the ever-relying encyclopedia continues, an assumption that the culture being borrowed from is also being oppressed by the culture doing the borrowing is prerequisite to the concept. This view of cultural borrowing is controversial both in academic circles and in general society. According to proponents of the concept of cultural appropriation, such cultural borrowings are problematic for a variety of reasons, ranging from group identity and questions of cultural oppression to claims of intellectual property rights. According to proponents of the theory, cultural appropriation differs from acculturation or assimilation in that the appropriation or misappropriation refers to the adoption of these cultural elements in a colonial manner. Elements are copied from a minority culture by members of the dominant culture, and these elements are used outside of their original cultural context, sometimes even against the expressed stated wishes of representatives of the originating culture. Often in the process, the original meaning of these cultural elements is distorted. Such uses can be viewed as disrespectful by members of the originating culture or even as a form of desecration. Cultural elements which may have deep meaning to the original culture can be reduced to exotic fashion by those from the dominant culture. When this is done, the imitator who does not experience that oppression is able to play temporarily an exotic other without experiencing any of the daily discriminations faced by other cultures. Now, one may think that the whole concept, as defined by Wikipedia, is utterly retarded. And one would indeed be correct in thinking so, but allow me to translate into common English what that mumbo-jumbo actually means. Cultural appropriation is used in the real world as a heavy blunt instrument to bash whites who dare to use elements of any culture for any reason, as long as the elements being used come from a culture in which most of the adherents of that culture are not white. That's really all there is to it. So, for instance, the blackened death metal band Ashames from Iran making money singing about Persian kings using a distinctly white feature, metal music that is absolutely okay. However, if a white person opens a business to invite other white people to teach and practice a distinctly non-white custom, let's say yoga, that's cultural appropriation, and even worse, it's profiting from the exploitation, marginalization, and oppression of other cultures. Can't you feel the oppression? Yeah, me neither. Now, I'll leave links in the low bar with more extreme and moderate explanations written by the proponents of this concept, namely the people who think that the Wikipedia definition of cultural appropriation is anything but made-up bullshit by retarded academics. If you're curious to learn more about it, feel free to hit the links and read. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that cultural appropriation is fundamentally good, and I said that because the definition implies that both the action and the so-called oppressive context constitute cultural appropriation. Well, I believe that all such actions, regardless of any made-up oppressive context, are good in and of itself because they make everyone culturally richer. Recently, PJTV published a video in which the hosts examine a country music singer from Kenya. Link in the low bar. So, a black guy with a band of other black guys is a star in Kenya by singing the music of those white racists from the flyover country, as progressives would say. PJTV, however, lauded the band, and the hosts were deeply moved by the fact that this Kenyan guy, Sir Elvis by his name, is making cash by appropriating white Southern American culture. Speaking of Elvis, a more moderate proponent of cultural appropriation as a sin over at the Quartz magazine informs us that Elvis Presley took some inspiration from the Negro soul singer Jackie Wilson, of whom Elvis was a fan of. This moderate author doesn't believe that Elvis was in the wrong to borrow elements from Wilson, but he believes it's an ugly racial dynamic that Elvis is the king of rock and roll, whilst Jackie Wilson is barely known, and apparently that's a bad consequence of cultural appropriation. But is that really true? I mean, upon listening to the music samples provided there, I can only conclude that Elvis simply took some elements of Jackie Wilson's work and made a far superior and better product. In fact, I would argue that Jackie Wilson would have been less known today had it not been for the fact that he inspired Elvis. I mean, think about it for a second. There are people out there willing to pay a fortune for a pair of underpants that belonged to Elvis Presley. Now, with that in mind, it's obvious that there are quite a few dedicated fans of Elvis out there who are determined to know everything there is to know about Elvis, and that includes his sources of inspiration. All these people were led to Jackie Wilson's work exclusively because Elvis borrowed some elements from there. All these people would have most likely never heard of Jackie Wilson without the sin of cultural appropriation being committed by Elvis. Here's another example. The Yale Slavic Women's Chorus, which is the Yale's oldest all-women vocal group. By their own admission, on their own page, this group is comprised by women who have no Slavic background whatsoever, and they usually don't actually speak the languages they sing in, and for all intents and purposes, all they do is appropriate the culture and language of various Slavic nations. They not only sing in languages they don't speak, but they wear costumes and perform dances of cultures they don't really understand. Now, if I were a progressive willing to apply the progressive logic of cultural appropriation to its logical conclusions, I would say that it is inappropriate for a Negro American female to sing songs that she can't possibly understand about Holodomor or about white blonde Ukrainian women who are the lovers of Cossacks. In fact, I could go even one step further with the progressive logic and say that it is inappropriate for an all-female and all-American group to sing songs that were originally written to be performed by white Ukrainian men and directed at female Cossacks. And if I wanted to go full retard, I could say that it is an unacceptable act of cultural appropriation for an American group to sing Serbian folklore because the US bombarded Belgrade, and as such, these women are part of a system of oppression of the Serbian people, and it is thus problematic for them to perform Serbian folklore. But thankfully, I'm not a progressive, nor am I insane. And as a result, I actually like the Yale Slavic chorus. And I'm not the only one. The president of the Republic of Macedonia appreciated their work as well and did not seem disturbed that his culture is being represented by a group led by a Negro female from Chicago. Throughout the human history, development in arts and sciences came partly due to ingenuity and partly due to inspiration drawn from various previous sources, some of those sources being, of course, external to the particular community designing the next development. In other words, the development of all civilizations, past and present on Earth, is due to cultural appropriation. What the proponents of cultural appropriation as a sin would like to see is a world of segregation, where cultures interact very little with each other and where cross-cultural inspirations are verboten. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in such a world. I don't know about you, but I want to live in a world where it is okay to enjoy some mixtures of cultures. I've seen on the internet once an individual was calling out white people for learning Spanish. Apparently, it's cultural appropriation to learn Spanish as a white person. Who knew that the 30-something, close to 40 million white Spaniards living in Spain were committing cultural appropriation of their own culture by learning their mother tongue? By that rationale, I am guilty of cultural appropriation because I curse in Norwegian and Swedish in my videos. And since the cultural appropriation sin stick applies only when the appropriation is from bigger groups to smaller groups, I am clearly guilty since the total number of Swedes and Norwegians on the planet is smaller than the total numbers of Romanians. I would hope I am on the safe side though with having a channel in English, right? I mean, well, according to Tumblr, I am, but you never know. In all seriousness, though, there is no way in hell one can be both a believer in cultural appropriation as a sin and a rational human being. Even acts of cultural appropriation that completely distort the original meaning are still okay to exist, because if they're really that bad, they eventually disappear into irrelevance if no one cares about them. The whole idea of policing other people's behavior for cultural appropriation is so asinine that, as I said at the beginning of this video, should not be tolerated for people over the age of 5 or 6. Now, I can understand a toddler throwing a temper tantrum because another toddler has an identical toy, but such tantrums should not be tolerated in grown-ups. If a culture is being appropriated, that to me is a sign that it's worth something since external people seek to preserve elements from it. In fact, a culture should seriously be concerned if nobody tries to appropriate it at all, because that is a sign of utter irrelevancy and, yes, inferiority. For these reasons, and I have by no means listed all of them, I dare to assert that actions that amount to cultural appropriation are fundamentally good in all cases because they are indisputable evidence that that culture is relevant enough for someone to want to appropriate some elements from it. As for those who are offended by cultural appropriation, they can go suck a bag of dicks and shut themselves out in a monolithic and segregated echo chamber. They all seem to like that, and yet they call me and people like me supremacists. Okay, I think that's enough for now. So, what do you think? Am I being too harsh? Maybe I am. But then again, as a speaker of several languages and the bearer of intimate knowledge about several cultures, I don't see myself as doing harm. So, tell me in the comments if or where I'm indeed wrong. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. Oh, did I appropriate Southern culture by saying y'all?